Today we're going to continue with the embryology, and in that we're going to continue after gametogenesis how all these gametes they are going to enter into the female reproductive system and how the male reproductive system is going to interact with it. So what about first let's have an idea about the female reproductive cycles. The female reproductive cycle, basically, generally, when you say the term menstrual cycle, that is the female reproductive cycle as a whole. This is what is menstrual cycle, that is the regular natural change that occurs in female reproductive systems, that is monthly changes, regular changes that occur. That takes place both in the uterus and the ovaries and makes the pregnancy possible. The cycle is required for the production. Two functions are made in this menstrual cycle. One is the production of oocytes, and for the other is the preparation of the uterus for pregnancy. So menstrual cycle includes two cycles, one in the uterus, preparation for pregnancy, and the other the preparation production of the oocytes in the ovaries. So the menstrual cycle occurs due to the change in the hormones, and that the most important is the estrogen hormone. This cycle results in the thickening of the lining of the uterus, that is preparation of the pregnancy, and then the growth of the egg. There are three stages, or you can say phases, of the menstrual cycle. Those which occur in the ovary, which they are labeled as the ovarian cycle, and it consists of the follicular phase, then there is the ovulation, and then there is the luteal phase. What all happens in these three phases in the ovaries. And then in the uterus, it is called the uterine cycle. So it is divided into menstruation, then the proliferative phase, and the secretory phase. So these are two, you can say, subgroupings of the menstrual cycle. Now, if you see in this picture, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle in from the uterus, you can see in the ovarian cycle, you have a follicular cycle, and then you have the luteal phase at the ovulation in the mid. And then in the uterus, it is the menstruation, then again proliferation, the cycle restarts. It's the proliferation of the uterus, that is the wall of the uterus is repaired, and then again the secretory phase. So this is just a broad picture of your menstrual cycle. What exactly does, let's take one of them is separately. The ovarian cycle, this is at puberty, it starts, basically begins in the regular monthly cycles, that is this not before puberty, and that is about 13 to 14 years. That cycle starts maybe as early as 12 years. This starts at puberty. This is called menarche. That is the initiation of this menstrual cycle is basically called as menarche. These sexual cycles, they are controlled by the higher centers, that is your hypothalamus. It releases the gonadotropin releasing hormone. This gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is going to act on the pituitary, and that on the anterior part of the pituitary, which is called as the adenohypophysis, which secretes the gonadotropins, and it stimulates the changes or the cyclic changes in the ovary. There are two hormones which are to be stimulated by from the anterior pituitary, that is the follicular stimulating hormone, that then further stimulates the production or works on the production of the estrogen, and then there is the luteinizing hormone which triggers the ovulation, and then there is the production of the corpus luteum, and corpus luteum produces the progesterone. Ovarian cycle, as I've said already, it has a follicular phase, it has ovulation, and it has a luteal phase. If you see in this picture, it shows collectively how the general outline, how the ovarian cycle works. It's the hypothalamic. The hypothalamic impulses, they go to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland produces the gonadotropins, and these gonadotropins are follicular stimulating hormone, and then the luteinizing hormone. The follicular stimulating hormone is going to affect the different phases of this follicle, that is the production of the ovum, or the follicle that is there till the mature ovum. Then it stops at ovulation, that is when the ovum is ready, the Graafian follicle, and then the ovum is released. Then after that, it is the luteinizing hormone, which starts initially, but it then gradually picks up its function, and then it is more active when there is production of the corpus luteum, that is after ovulation. The luteinizing hormone comes into action, because the corpus luteum is produced after the exit of the ovum, and then this corpus luteum produces the progesterone, and then if pregnancy doesn't occur, there is this regenerating corpus luteum. This cycle shows you a collective way how the cells are working and at what steps the different cells are taking place. Now, this is initially the production of the oocytes. Then these are the primordial follicles, that is at birth. This is the picture that you have at birth. This is the primordial follicles, and these primordial follicles, they start by the secretion at sexual maturity. These start to act, and by they start to mature. These primordial follicles containing the primary oocytes, they mature, and then they become the early primordial follicle, primary follicle. This primary follicle, then it multiplies. The cells, they're going to multiply, then it's going to convert into the second meiotic, secondary follicle at this, at puberty, the first meiotic, because the meiotic division, as we have already said, is arrested at birth in the prophase, and then it's going to continue at puberty, and by then it is going to secondary follicle is produced, it's going to the first meiotic division is going to be completed, and then it starts automatically the second meiotic division, and then it forms the Graafian follicle. But second meiotic division does not complete. It is the protein stage, or it is arrested, and it only completes when the fertilization takes place. So if the ovulation occurs, then there is corpus luteum forms if after ovulation, and if no fertilization, then this corpus luteum is going to degenerate. The follicular development, as we see, ovarian follicle is characterized by what are the different things which are going to occur when we say it is a follicle which is developing. The growth and the differentiation of first is the primary oocyte, that is, we're going to say the different from the primordial, primary, and then secondary oocyte, and then the proliferation of the follicular cells, that is the cells in the follicle, they are going to grow, and then the formation of the zona pellucida, that is between the theca outside and the oocytes inside, and then the development of the follicula, theca follicula, that is the cyst that is going to form. The primordial germ cells, they basically migrate into the developing gonads early in embryogenesis and differentiate into the oogonia. Oogonia proliferates by mitosis, enlarge and develop, called the primary oocytes, and enter the first meiotic division on the pathway to make gametes by meiosis, 3 to 8 months. Then these primary oocytes become arrested, as I've said, at birth in the prophase, and the first meiotic division until the female become at puberty. At sexual puberty, all this is occurring in the ovary. At sexual maturity, a small number of primary oocytes mature, and only it's just the first meiotic division to become the secondary, and under the influence of the follicular stimulating hormone. This is the primordial follicle. The oocyte is arrested in the last phase of prophase, known as the dichrotein stage. At this stage, it is surrounded by a single layer. That is the primordial follicle. These are the production or the changes of the Graafian follicle which is going to occur. This is the primordial follicle. Then you produce the primary follicle. When the primordial follicle is stimulated, it becomes a primary follicle. The oocyte enlarges and the follicular cells, they divide. The follicle has 2 layers of follicular cells called the primary follicle. These cells continue to hypertrophy and produce many larging cells, and this is what we call as the multiplication of the follicular cell. It enlarges and the cells increase in number. Then is the secondary follicle. The primary follicle develops into a secondary follicle. The secondary looks very similar to the primary, except that they are larger and some more follicular cells, and there's accumulation of fluid in these intercellular spaces. If you see this picture, this is the secondary follicle when there is the accumulation of the fluid in it. The accumulation of fluid in this, and that is the follicular fluid, and this gradually is what we call as the antrum, the development of the antrum. Small area is just where you don't have the cavity or the antrum, and that is where the cells are just attached to the wall, and that is called the cumulus oophrus. The surrounding theca, then, that is the connective tissue on the outside, is going to differentiate into theca interna and theca externa. Interna is going to secrete androgen and follicular fluid. The more fibrous, and externa is spindle shaped, and they converted into estrogen by the granulosa cells. You see this is the antrum that is produced. Then you have the Graafian follicle. The Graafian follicle is this, just a quick recollection how the different stages of the follicle are. That secondary follicle develops into the Graafian follicle. So initially we had primordial follicle, then primary follicle, secondary follicle, and the mature is the Graafian follicle. The first meiotic division is now finished. Secondary has starts, and the second meiotic start is first meiotic mostly goes into two daughter cells. The other becomes the polar body, as we have already said. The fluid enters into this antrum, and this is the follicular cells, membrana granulosa, and then this is called the rest of the cells which surround project into the antrum are called the humulus oophrus. There is basement membrane between the granulosa cells and the theca interna. Fibrous theca merges with the surrounding stroma. So you have interna and externa on the outside. The oocyte, the zona pellucida, and the follicular cells surrounding the oocyte known as corona radiata are all expelled. That means what at ovulation, what happens is oocyte, the zona pellucida, and the follicle cells, they are expelled out at ovulation, which enter into the fallopian tube. And this is going to further, once released, begins its seven meiotic division. As far as metaphase, carries only if oocyte is fertilized. So you see this in the ovarian cycle. What we have at different phases is pool of growing follicle supplying primordial follicle, then into the primary or the pre-antral follicle, that is before the antrum is formed, then the secondary or the antral follicle where you have the cavity, and then the pre-ovulatory or the Graafian follicle that is mature. So that is the difference. So you have primordial, primary, secondary, and the Graafian follicle. These are the different stages. If you see in this picture, this is the primordial follicle, single cells around it. Then this is the pre-antral follicle because there is no formation of the antrum as yet. This is the late pre-antral, that is multiplication. The one cell layer has become multiplied and it has formed a number of layers outside. Then there is the antrum. This is, that is, the antrum is the cavity formation is there, and outside the connective tissue you can see that theca externa and interna, they develop. And then this is the pre-ovulatory, that is the mature one, or what you call as the Graafian follicle, the last picture. And this Graafian follicle is the oocyte in one side, and it has not completed a second meiotic division, waiting after ovulation when there is going to be fertilization. This second meiotic division is going to be complete. This is the Laker folliculi, the granulosa cells, the theca cells are on the outside, and this small portion where the oocyte is attached to the these granulosa cells, that part is what we call as the humulus oophrus. This is going to be released out. The granulosa cells, the ovum, and this humulus oophrus is going to be released out in ovulation. So these are the different steps in the follicle development: primordial, pre-antral, or you can call primary and secondary, then antral, and then the pre-ovulatory or the Graafian follicle. These are the different stages. Again, this picture shows you the different stages of the follicle formation. Primordial, that is resting one cell layer outside, then secondary, small primary activated, secondary pre-antral, that is more cells divide, the Graafian cells or the follicular cells, then the follicular cells multiply, then there is small cavities start develop, that is what we call as the antral. Because the full antral is not developed as yet, this is what we call as the pre-ovulatory or the antral. And then ovum is released, and then these are the connective tissue outside, and then this, all the Graafian follicle cells, they are going to form the theca interna cells, the theca lutein cells. These cells are going to be what they start to produce the corpus luteum. When the changes occur, that is the lipid material comes in, because these hormones they are cholesterol in nature. And then this is going to, if this pregnancy occurs, this corpus luteum is going to just maintain the developing embryo till the placenta takes over the function of producing the progesterone. If there is no pregnancy or no fertilization occurs, this corpus luteum is going to retrogress and it is going to become the corpus albicans. Then development of the follicle. So again, it is just a repetition because this is just to understand at what is happening at different stages. Primary oocyte begins to grow. Oogonia changes into primary oocyte, that is the primordial follicle. Follicular cell form flat cuboidal stratified layer becomes, that is what we call, when from one layer it is the follicular cells, it granulosa cells, that is going to be called as the primary follicles. Then this separating from ovarian connective tissue, that is the stroma, then you have that forms the theca folliculi, that is the stromal cells on the outside of the follicle, that is called the theca or your connective tissue. And this connective tissue is going to develop into interna and externa. The oocyte secretes the layers of glycoprotein on the surface of the oocyte. This forms the zona pellucida. So V1 is the function that is going to occur in the maturation of the ovary. the oocytes, that is the formation of the follicle, maturation of the follicle. Then the other we said was the zona pellucida. If you see in this picture, this black thing that you see is clearer in this pink thing that you see, this outside the oocyte, that is the zona pellucida. So one layer multiplying into many cells layer, then there's the preantral layer, then it produces between the follicular cells and the oocytes the zona pellucida that develops. Then the theca layers multiply, that is theca interna and theca externa are going to form. Then if you see, this is surface of the single layer oogonia, primary oocytes in prophase 1. Then this is the cell oocytes showing you the cells of meiotic division. The diplotin stage at birth, this is going to be crested, or the primary oocyte at newborn level. Then this follicle is going to multiply or grow. This is a primordial follicle, one cell, then it is going to produce increased size. The outside granulosa cells are going to increase in size. They're going to become the larger one. Then it's this reddish thing that is going to be produced by these cells, that is called the zona pellucida between the oocyte and the cells. And then it's going to again multiply. These cells are going to become stratified, increasing in number. And this is the primary follicle. From growing follicle, primary follicle, zona pellucida. These show you the different stages and the changes which occur. Then this is the beginning of the zona pellucida. This is the primary follicle that has been formed. This primary follicle is then going to enter into this follicular antrum or preantral, that is in the granulosa cells. If you see in this picture, this outside is your theca layer, that is theca interna and theca externa, that is the stroma that is there. Then this is the oocyte, primary oocyte in the center with the zona pellucida, and then you have the graphene, the follicular cell. These follicular cells then have a cavity development, which is called the follicular antrum. This antrum is the pre-antral stage. This, and then this antrum is going to increase. Antrum is nothing but a cavity. This antrum in the follicular cells is going to increase in size. These follicular cells were initially just the primordial follicle, one cell layer. Then the cell size that was flat, cylindrical, the spindle shaped, then it became cuboidal, cuboidal to multiple layer, that is stratified layer is going to occur. That is all what is the follicular cells or the granulosa cells which are there. They are going to surround the oocyte. Then the oocyte and the granulosa cells, they are separated by this pinkish layer, that is the zona pellucida. This is all occurring when the follicle is maturing, and then the stroma on the outside is developing, that is developing into theca interna and theca externa. All the way the cavity is surrounding the oocyte. It's just a small space where the granulosa cells are in intimate contact with the oocyte. That place is what we call as the cumulus oophrus. So this is basically the mature follicle, what we call as the Graafian follicle. And theca is nothing but the connective tissue layer or the stroma on the outside of the follicle. So you have the development of the follicular cells, you have the development of the zona pellucida, and then you have the development of the theca folliculi. The theca folliculi are organized, theca interna and theca externa. They enter into this across the zona pellucida transport for transport material. Each ovarian cycle, which is preantral, grows under the influence of follicular stimulating hormone. Follicular stimulating hormone is going to come from the anterior part of the pituitary gland. One follicle reaches, many start to grow, but only one reaches maturity. This, after maturity, the rest is that they disintegrate, and only this is going to be thrown out of the ovary. Oocyte and surrounding follicular cells degenerate and are replaced by the connective tissue forming the corpus heteroticum. That is, if those which are not expelled out, they are going to become corpus heteroticum, that is, they are going to degenerate. FSH also stimulates the maturation of the follicular cells surrounding the oocyte. So basically, it is the role of the follicular stimulating hormone. Theca interna and externa, interna and granule produce estrogen, androstenedione, and testosterone. So when estrogen is produced by these theca cells, the result is that this estrogen is going to act on the uterus. So the uterine endometrium enters the follicular, or what we call as the proliferative phase. This is going to occur after the menstruation has finished, and the layer or the walls of the uterus are disintegrated and it becomes very thin. That has to enter into proliferation, become normal again. That is going to be by the effect of the estrogen. Then the thinning of the cervical mucus occurs to allow the passage of sperm. That is, after the oocyte has been expelled, this all production of the estrogen is going to occur. And if this cervical mucus becomes thin to allow the passage of sperm, if fertilization occurs, then all the other changes are going to occur. If it does not occur, then the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland is going to stimulate the luteinizing hormone that is going to produce the second half of the menstrual cycle, that is which the effects on the uterus will go complete the cycle. Then in the mid cycle, there is an LH surge, that is first 50 days. It's basically the menstrual cycle is roughly 30 days, 28 days to 38. The first 14 days is basically the function of the luteinizing hormone. That is the follicular stimulating hormone, which is basically acting on the follicle, maturing it to the Graafian follicle level. Then once the Graafian follicle is released, this from the ovary, then it comes into the luteinizing hormone comes into action. This luteinizing hormone increases and completes the cycle. Then this hormone is going to act on the second half of the uterus, that is, and it also acts on the corpus luteum in the ovary and acts on the uterus, producing the circulating edematous and highly vascular uterine wall, so as to prepare the bed for the which is expected to receive the developing ovum. So the promotes the oocytes to complete meiosis 1 and initiate meiosis 2. That is, after ovulation, the first meiotic division is finished and the second starts automatically, but it is not going to be complete. It's going to stay on till the middle. Stimulates the production of progesterone by the follicular stroma cells, that is luteinizing hormone, because the ovum has released out. What all is left is going to produce your corpus luteum. This corpus luteum is going to produce your progesterone. Progesterone is going to have this luteinizing effect on the uterine wall, causes and also acts on the follicle to rupture and ovulation to occur. I will show you if you see in this picture. The hypothalamus is acting on the pituitary gland, that is producing the gonadotrophin releasing hormone. Gonadotrophin releasing hormone is producing FSH and LH. FSH and LH, FSH are going to help in the production of the Graafian follicle, that is your mature follicle. This mature follicle, by the effect of the FSH into small amount, the surge of the LH is going to produce the ovulation. That is the Graafian follicle. Just the cumulus oocyte and the zona pellucida, they are released out. The cavity is there and the granulosa cells, they stay in. This granulosa cells, and then they're going to produce the corpus luteum. That is the corpus luteum under the effect of luteinizing hormone. This corpus luteum is going to produce the progesterone. Initially, the ovary was producing the estrogen, which was preparing this uterine bed. If you see this was after menstruation. It was affecting the the bed of the uterus. Then, when the corpus luteum starts to produce progesterone, both together they further affect the wall of the uterus. And then, if this pregnancy does not occur, and this is corpus luteum is going to degenerate. This corpus luteum, once it degenerates, progesterone is finished, and then there is again the starting of the menstrual cycle, if you see in this phase. So basically what happens is, during this cycle basically starts once the menstruation occurs. Menstruation is 6 to 7 days. After menstruation, the basal layer is all that is left. The rest of the layers they are shed off. Then after this, the proliferation is going to start. So the estrogen, which is going to come from the follicles, that is going to affect on the walls of the uterus, and it is going to produce increase in size of the uterine wall, which has become very thin after menstruation. This phase is what we call, by the effect of estrogen, is called the proliferative phase. This proliferative phase goes roughly till the middle, till the ovulation occurs. Once the ovulation occurs, corpus luteum is produced. It produces progesterone. This proliferative phase changes over to the luteal phase. Initially, it was just the growth of the uterine wall. Then it becomes vascular, it becomes edematous, and all those changes occur. That layer is called the luteinizing phase. This luteinizing phase, then at the end of this, there's going to be, if fertilization doesn't occur, there is going to be an ischemia of the vessels, which leads to shedding of the uterine wall, and then again the menstrual layer starts. So this is an interaction between the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. They do not act independently. Then once the follicle has matured, the preceding the ovulation, under the influence of this and LH, the secondary follicle grows to a diameter this, causes the primary oocyte to complete this follicle to enter the pre-ovulatory stage. Then it is initiated, rested in the metaphase. The surface of the ovary becomes to bulge locally at the apex. This is called the stigma, and avascular, by the pressure of is avascular spot, the stigma appears. This makes the wall weaken, and this is going to result in the rupturing of the wall of the ovary, and that is going to release the ovum. So what all is released is theca is on the outside, granulosa cells are on the inside, the oocyte, the zona pellucida, and the cumulus oophrus. This is all which is going to be released out at the time of ovulation. Then the rest of this cavity, this becomes a crumpled bag, and the crumpled bag is then going to produce your corpus luteum. And the cell, it is the oocyte is now in the stage of second meiotic division, but this is going to be arrested at the initial stage, and it's not going to complete until your fertilization occurs. So this is the mature follicle which occurs in the follicular phases. This in the ovulation occurs, and then the corpus luteum is produced. So when the graphene follicle is produced, the surface of the ovary begins to bulge locally at the apex, and that point where it bulges, that is point is called the stigma, an avascular spot because of the pressure, and the wall becomes weak, and this weakening of the wall leads to the rupture, and then the ovum is released, really increases the ovarian wall muscular contractions, and then this extrudes the oocyte. This along with the cumulus oophrus. This breaks free. At this time, the fimbria of the fallopian tube or the uterine tube, they are coming in contact at the time of ovulation, and they cover like the feet of the octopus to the area where the stigma is formed. And once this oocyte is floating out, it is sucked in by the fallopian tube, and it is taken in into the fallopian tube. Cumulus oophrus cells rearrange around the corona pellucida, so to form what is called the corona radiata. That is just the arrangement which is there. So this is the fallopian tube is on the sides, and this is the ovary. When the graphene follicle is mature, it stretches the wall, producing an avascular spot of the ovary. That is what we call a stigma. At the stigma, there's ruptures, and then this oocyte is released. And for to relieve the capture this released oocyte, the infundibulum or the fimbria of the tube, they are covering the ovary. They suck in the oocyte, which is released along with the cumulus oophrus, and they take it up into the ampulla of the fallopian tube, and all what the cavity was left in the ovary, that is going to develop into the corpus luteum. Then by the contractions of this uterine tube, this ovum is going to be taken up into the from the ovary up into the tube, and the ampulla of the tube where it is going to be, if fertilization occurs, it is that spot which is where the fertilization is going to occur in the uterine tube. You see in this picture, this is the different stages of the follicles. Then the ruptured follicle, the cumulus oophrus, and it is in the second meiotic division. So second meiotic division is not complete. This is going to be completed only if fertilization occurs. This fimbria, it sucks in the oocyte, then goes on to the ampulla. In the ampulla, this is going to stay on. The sperm cells, they are going to reach the ampulla, and if fertilization occurs, the second meiotic division is going to complete. And once this zygote is formed, this is going to start the multiplication and the cleavage, and this is going to pass on into the uterus. So basically what happens is that there are, from the follicle, there are different stages in this ovarian. Menstrual cycle is 2 steps. The menstrual cycle is the ovarian cycle plus the uterine cycle. Ovarian cycle is for the follicular phase, lutein phase, and the proliferative phase. and whereas in this ovary, the uterus, it is your menstrual cycle. Then you have the proliferative phase and you have the luteal phase. So these two together are what we call as the menstrual cycle. The initial thing in the ovary, what is going to occur is the proliferation of the follicle. That is oogonia. Oogonia come into the ovary. Ovary is produce the primary oocyte or the primordial follicle with the one cell layer, the granulosa cells. This then starts to multiply. This is going to form the follicle. Many follicles start to form, but only one reaches its maturity. Primary one layer follicle is going to mature, multiply, and this is going to become into the formation of the many layer, that is single layer, then cuboidal cells, then stratum at the many layer granulosa cells outside the oocyte. This is being produced. This granulosa cells is then, this is the development of the follicle. These granulosa cells then are going to reach, initially we had the primordial follicle, then we call it, when it starts to grow, we call it the primary follicle, and then this primary follicle into the secondary, and then it becomes the preantral. That means in the granulosa cell, small cavities start to appear. These cavities are called the antrum. So when in the initial stages, these are called the preantral stage. Then this preantral stage is then going to enter into the antral stage or the mature Graafian follicle when a complete cavity is formed. The oocyte is just pushed. If I show you this picture, if you see it in this picture, this one is the mature follicle. That means the cavity has formed, the oocyte is pushed towards one side, and this all the granulosa cells on the outside, they're called the cumulus oophrus. This has finished its first meiotic division and entered into the second meiotic division. But this is then the secondary oocyte is now in the initial stages of the second meiotic division. It will not complete. It forms the stigma and it is going to release out. So if you see these different stages, this is the mature follicle, this is the pre-ovulatory follicle or your antral follicle, or you can call it the Graafian follicle. This is the mature cells. Only this part is the cumulus oophrus. This is going to be released out. Then another thing that is going to occur when the development of the follicle is that the zona pellucida is going to form. This zona pellucida is going to be between the granulosa cells and the oocyte. Then if I show you the development of the theca layers, that is the connective tissue on the outside. So primary oocyte is going to occur, follicle when it is developing, follicular cells are forming, zona pellucida is forming, and development of the theca folliculi is going to occur. And so once this is formed, then it is going to rupture out. So basically, if we see this stage, this shows you the different changes which are occurring. This is the meiotic division which is occurring. This produces what is there, that is the primordial follicle. That is the from the gametogenesis, a primordial follicle, one cell layer, and that is arrested at birth. This is then enters into for further development, sexually maturity at puberty. This is going to start at sexual maturity. This one cell layer, this oocyte is then going to grow in size. Early primordial follicle, from primordial it becomes primary, then the granulosa cells, they are going to multiply, and these are going to become the stratified layer. Stratified follicles are going to become the secondary follicle. At this stage, the first meiotic division is complete and it initially starts the second meiotic division. Then this secondary follicle is going to become a preantral follicle. This is the preantral. When the small cavities develop, this becomes the antral follicle or the Graafian follicle and contains the secondary oocyte. And this, the second meiotic division has started, and then it becomes comes at the surface of the ovary. Then there is ovulation. Second meiotic division is arrested at this phase. There is no completion. Only if fertilization occurs, this second meiotic division is going to complete. And the follicle which is there in the inside the rest, it is going to become crumpled and it's going to form the corpus luteum. If no fertilization occurs, this corpus luteum is going to become corpus albicans, that is, it degenerate. So these are the different stages, and it is a correlation between the different primordial, primary, secondary. When you have your first meiotic division, where at what level you're having your second meiotic division, which is there. right? So then we go on to this layer, that is a middle pain, that is when ovulation occurs. During ovulation, some women feel slight pain in the middle of the cycle, that is roughly 15 days, because ovulation occurs in the middle of the menstrual cycle. This is called the Midsmer's middle spurs pain. That is because it is in the middle. It is, and at this time, generally, the women, if you they check the temperature, there is rise in the basal temperature. If the family, the husband and the wife, they are planning to have a baby, this is the actual time that the ovulation has occurred, and they can program their and the rise in the basal temperature. These two things, they and will show you that at the time ovulation can occur, and they can plan their family, that is preventing or the becoming the starting the family. So this is an level or the time when the level rough estimate of the ovulation is there, that is the ovum is released, and if they have a relationship, then they can be fertilization, and fertilization can proceed on to pregnancy. So some women fail to ovulate because of a low concentration of gonadotrophins. Administration of and so increased basal temperature at the 14th to 15th day of the cycle is a rough estimate to tell that at this time the ovulation has occurred. Administration of certain gonadotrophins, that is if certain females, they do not, because of the lack of these hormones, they do not ovulate, that means the cycle is there but the ovum is not released, then they are given certain drugs, that is the gonadotrophin release. These stimulate the follicle to grow. This drug is called the clomiphene citrate, and it helps the ovulation to occur, and then produce this fertilization can occur afterwards to stimulate the follicle to grow. But in this, it's often seen that it not only stimulates one ovum or the one follicle to mature, but it, many follicles, they mature. So with the onset of or taking up of this drug, many multiple births are seen as a result of these drugs. Likelihood of multiple pregnancies, so 10 times higher than in the general population if this drug is given, because it stimulates many follicles, and they are released instead of the normal one follicle starting is many, but only one matures and is released. But if this drug is given, it is seen that multiple follicles are matured and they are released, and so the end is multiple pregnancies. So middle spurs or middle pain is basically sometimes they females feel pain at the middle of the cycle at the level of the ovulation, and at this time it's that is why it is called the middle pain. And at this time there is rise in basal temperature, and if you start trying to plan a family, this is a point that rise in basal temperature gives an idea that at this time ovulation is occurring, and this is an ideal time whether to start a family or prevent a family. Then corpus luteum. After ovulation, granulosa cells in the ruptured follicles, theca interna, are vascularized. Under the influence of LH, cells develop a yellowish pigment. These are called the lutein cells. So that is forms the corpus luteum and secrete estrogen and progesterone. And this estrogen and progesterone is going to act on the uterus, and it's going to enter into the secretory phase. And this is also if it is the second half of the menstrual cycle, and if it is the fertilization process, then it is going to help the implantation of the embryo, or if it is just the normal menstrual cycle, then it will be the breakdown of this endometrium. So corpus albicans, if no fertilization occurs, corpus luteum reaches maximum, shrinks, it becomes whitish, and it becomes a fibrotic scar. It is called the corpus albicans. Progesterone is decreased, and that stimulates the formation of the progesterone. Production decreases, and it precipitates menstrual bleeding. If ovum is fertilized, the degeneration is prevented. It continues to produce corpus, the secreted by the progesterone. This prepares the bed of the uterus, and it helps to stabilize the pregnancy till the placenta is formed, which starts to produce the progesterone. So as the baby grows, this progesterone and the stability of the pregnancy or the growing embryo is done by this progesterone from the corpus luteum. Once the progesterone is produced, the placenta is developed, then the progesterone is taken over, production of progesterone is taken over by the placenta. So the corpus luteum continues to grow and forms the corpus luteum of pregnancy. So first, it is, if no pregnancy occurs, it is going to be called as corpus luteum of menstruation. If pregnancy occurs, this corpus luteum is going to be called as the corpus luteum of pregnancy. And if it is degenerated, it is going to be called the corpus albicans. It is going to secrete till the 4th month. Then placenta becomes adequate and produces progesterone. It is going to maintain the pregnancy. And removal of corpus luteum if before pregnancy after the 4th month leads to abortion because the level of the placenta that drops. Then this menstrual cycle, that is the effect on the endometrium. The cycle or menstrual cycle or the endometrial cycle, the oocyte matures, is ovulated and enters into the uterine tube. Hormones, they start to produce estrogen and progesterone. Monthly changes, they act on the uterus. 21st day is designated as day on which the menstrual flow, when the menstruation starts. The cycle date is 28 days and the first day is considered as that day when the menstrual flow starts. Menstrual cycle in 90% of the women, the length of the cycle ranges between 23 and 35 days. Alteration in the duration of cycle can be there. So phases of the menstrual cycle is, first, the time period is menstruation, then the follicular phase, then the ovulation, and the luteal phase is going to occur. Phases, this is menstrual cycle passes through 3 stages, the follicular or proliferative. After the menstruation, you can put menstrual cycle phase initially or in the end also, because it starts after the menstrual phase, then it goes on to the proliferative phase or the follicular phase when the follicle is developing. There in the ovary, the follicle is developing, and here the endometrial uterus is proliferating. Then there is the secretory phase, that is the luteinizing hormone in the ovary is being produced, and it is the progesterone phase which is acting on the endometrial wall, and then again the menstrual phase. So changes in the estrogen and progesterone level causes cyclical changes in the female reproductive tract, and that is the endometrium. First is the menstrual phase of this layer of the uterine part of the menstrual cycle. The functional layer of the uterine wall is sloughed off and discarded with the menstrual flow. Menses last 4 to 5 days. Shedding of the endometrium, that is compact and spongy layers, that is the functional layer, marks the beginning of the menstrual phase. After the menstrual phase, you have 2 layers, the functional layer and the basal layer. The functional has 2 portions. The one is a compact and the spongy. Compact to some extent is going to stay on, spongy is shed off. And then the basal layer that stays on. After menstruation, the eroded endometrium becomes thin. That means the upper 2 layers are going to be shed off, so it becomes thin. So that has to go back to its normal thickness. So that is the proliferative phase because of the estrogen that is under the effect of the follicular stimulating hormone. So for 9 days coincides with the growth of the ovarian follicles controlled by the estrogen. Threefold increase in the thickness of the endometrium. The proliferation is just multiplication of the cells and the blood vessels and the glands which are there. Then the surface epithelium reforms and covers the endometrium. Glands increase in number and the arteries elongate. So these are the 3 things which occur, that is they proliferate and they grow in size. You see, if you see in this picture, this is the different phases. You have the basal layer, then you have the functional layer. Function is compact and spongy. This basal layer is going to stay on. The functional layer, the compact and the spongy layer, they're going to be shed off. So this increases. Then the third is your secretory or the luteal phase. Produce stimulates, the glands become rich in glycogen, tortuous saccular, the glands, then the endometrium thickens, hormones, when increased fluid in the connective tissue, and the blood vessels, they become coiled. They are the spiral arteries, they become coiled. So it becomes edematous, the endometrium, the blood vessels then become increasingly coiled, and the venous network, large lacunae, venous spaces develop, direct atriovenous anastomosis is prominent. So in that, it's just only the proliferation. The proliferative phase, what occurs is epithelium reforms of the endometrium, glands increase in number, and the spiral arteries elongate, which it becomes edematous in case of the luteal phase. You see functional and the basal layer. And then at the anovulatory menstrual cycles, if the ovary may not produce a mature follicle and ovulation does not occur, and these are called the anovulatory cycles. The endometrial changes are minimal. The proliferative endometrium develops, no ovulation occurs, No corpus luteum forms. The endometrium does not progress to the luteal phase. It remains in the proliferate until menstruation occurs because luteinizing hormone. There is no corpus luteum because there is no ovum, there is no ovulation, there is no shedding up, there is no corpus luteum form, there is no progesterone. So the the luteal phase is not there, remains in the proliferative phase until the menstruation starts. That is when it is an anovulatory. The cycle is there, but it is without the formation of the ovum. These anovulatory cycle result from ovarian hypofunctioning, that is, ovaries not functioning normally, or in contraceptives, that is, you are giving drugs which are suppressing your normal functioning of the ovum, that is, birth control pills. With or without estrogen, they inhibit these drugs are going to inhibit your pituitary and the hypothalamus, and so they are going to suppress your follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So interrelation brain, pituitary, ovary, and the uterus. That is again what I showed you before. If no fertilization occurs, corpus luteum is going to degenerate, estrogen and progesterone levels fall, secretory endometrium enters an ischemic phase, and that menstruation starts. So if this is a collective function, hypothalamus, gonadotrophin releasing hormone, pituitary, anterior part, FSH produces this follicle. The Graafian follicle is produced with the ovum in there. Then this is is released at the middle of the cycle where their luteinizing hormone is also having an effect. The granulosa cells along with the ovum, along with the zona pellucida, they are released. This is called at the level of the stigma. Then what is left, granulosa cells, is going to produce the corpus luteum, a crumpled mass. Then again there is the production of the from, in addition to the estrogen, you're having the production of the progesterone. So these hormones are all acting, produced from the ovary. They are acting on side by side onto the walls of the endometrium. Initially, after menstruation, the endometrium is thin. Once the follicle starts to grow, the estrogen is acting on the uterus. This is producing your proliferative phase over there. That is again rebuilding the endometrium to just the proliferation. Then when the ovulation is complete, that means progesterone starts to act. Is produced, progesterone is going to make it more vascular, edematous, coiled blood vessels. And if there is no fertilization, then this, because of the ischemic phase, the blood vessels are become tortuous, coiled, and they go into an ischemic phase. This ischemic phase then deprives the endometrium of the blood vessel, the blood supply. So this becomes, they then start to shed off, and it's only the basal layer which is going to maintain the functional layer, which is then going to be shed off, and that is the menstrual cycle again. And so it is going to be repeated again and again. So you can see that there is a correlation between the ovarian and the endometrial cycle, and these two together are what we call as your menstrual cycle. So the menstruation occurs, and it is again going to start. So if you see in this, again, ovulation, corpus luteum, degenerating corpus luteum. This is at menstrual phase. The ovary is, the endometrium is very small in height. Once estrogen produces, the proliferative phase, the blood vessels, the level of the endometrium, that increases. When progesterone increases, the vessels become tortuous, coiled, the glands become very edematous, that is, secretions increase because they are ready to prepare to accept the implanted ovum. That is what is expected, that the ovum will be embedded in the walls of the uterus. That is a preparation for the fertilized ovum, where for the expected growing baby. Then this is the artery which is tortuous. If this does not occur, fertilization does not occur, this becomes the ischemic phase, and this ischemic phase again going to shed off the uterus. So you can see the increase and decrease in the height of the endometrium and the changes, that is because of the hormones. This again is the ischemic phase, occurs when the oocyte is not fertilized. Ischemia, reduced blood flow, spiral arteries constrict, pale appearance, decreasing the progesterone by degenerating. Hormone is withdrawal, stoppage of the glandular secretion, a loss of interstitial marked shrinking of the endometrium, and that results in bleeding. End of ischemic phase becomes constricted, longer period, gradually it is intermittent. Venous stasis, patchy ischemic, the tissue falls off, and the tissue and the rupture of the damaged vessel walls followed, blood seeps into the surrounding connective tissue. So there is the endometrium is damaged, the blood seeps out into the endometrium, and that produces the, so when it is shed off along with the blood plus the tissue debris, small pools of blood form and break through the endometrial surface, resulting in bleeding into the uterine lumen and from the vagina. So both these things. So pieces of endometrium detach and pass into the uterine cavity. Torn pieces of blood bleed. It's about 20 to 80 ml that is there. So the entire compact layer and most of the spongy layer of the endometrium are discarded in menses. That is the functional layer. This is the remnants of the spongy and the basal layers undergo regeneration during subsequent proliferative phase of the endometrium. That is the basal layer. So compact and spongy layer is functional and the basal layer stays. The spongy layer, a small amount is left. That plus the basal layer, they go undergo regeneration and then rebuild the in the proliferative phase, and that produces the endometrium again. So fertilization occurs. If fertilization occurs, cleavage of the zygote and blastogenesis occurs, begins to implant in the endometrium which was prepared by the hormones. HCG keeps the corpus luteum. This HCG keeps the corpus luteum secreting the estrogen, and the progesterone. Progesterone keeps the baby growing until unless the placenta is formed, luteal phase continues and menstruation does not occur. Okay, so you can see in this. This is once fertilization occurs, this is implantation starts to occur. The coiled artery is increased edematous, and this is the embryo is implanted. Corpus luteum continues to produce progesterone and it stabilizes the pregnancy in the initial phase. You can see it in the gravid phase or the pregnant phase. And then once the placenta forms, this stability of the pregnancy is taken up by the placenta by the production of the hormones. So you can see the different stages. If pregnancy occurs, menstrual cycle ceases and the endometrium passes into a pregnancy phase. With the termination of the pregnancy, the ovarian and the menstrual cycle resume after a variable period, and the pregnancy does not occur. The reproductive cycles normally continue until menopause. Right? So this is a collection. Maturation of the follicle or estrogen affects the, this is the beginning of the menstrual cycle. After menstruation, the basal layer of the endometrium is very thin. It is regenerated by the estrogen. This builds up the glands, the cells and the blood vessels. Once the ovulation occurs, corpus luteum is produced. Corpus luteum produces a progesterone. These progesterones, they are going to act on the glands. Arteries become tortuous, edematous glands, and this becomes edematous, and this is going to grow. If there is no fertilization, then this is going to become an ischemic phase. The ischemic, the blood vessels are going to distort the tissue. The tissue debris are released, blood is seeping into the tissues, and this is going to be sloughed off into the lumen of the uterus, and then menstruation occurs. If the fertilization occurs, this is going to continue in the, not from the menstrual phase, it is going to go into the or pregnant phase or the gravid phase, and the corpus luteum continues to produce the progesterone, and that is going to help in the developing ovum, and that is the corpus luteum of the pregnancy. Initially it was corpus luteum of menstruation. If menstruation or pregnancy occurs, it is going to be called the corpus luteum of pregnancy. It does not stop its function, it produces on the progesterone. So that was about the menstrual cycle, the different phases. This picture very clearly depicts the different phases which are there. So that is about the menstrual cycle and then the different stages. So first we said the formation of the follicle was, you had the initially there was first meiotic primordial follicle at birth. They stopped first meiotic division. Then when at puberty, this first meiotic division starts again. It completes the first meiotic division and produces the primary follicle and a polar body. This polar body then goes on to the secondary follicle. This secondary follicle and the second meiotic division starts. The polar body produces two polar bodies, and this secondary follicle, this produces one mature follicle and one another polar body. Then this meiotic division is there at the ovulation. At the ovulation, the second meiotic division is there. Once the fertilization occurs, this meiotic division is going to continue. Otherwise, it is not going to continue. So this is about the menstrual cycle, the what changes occur in the ovary and what changes occur in the uterus. So they are interrelated changes which are going to occur. I hope it is clear, and next time inshallah we'll start with the next topic, that is in continuation. We have prepared the gametes, we have prepared the ovary producing the fertilized ovum with the meiotic division taking place, and then it is the preparation of the uterine bed. This uterine bed is then going to be ready whether to accept the fertilized ovum or whether it is just menstrual cycle. Then we are going to talk about how this is going to embed, or how these gametes, they're going to release the uterus or the ovary, and then how they are going to be embedded in the wall once the fertilization occurs. Okay then, thank you.